When you've been married for 12 years, you think you know the person sleeping beside you every night. That's how I felt about Lauren. I thought I had her figured out. But as I watched her over the past couple of months, acting distant, guarding her phone like it held the nuclear codes, and constantly working late, it felt like I was living with a stranger. At first, I told myself I was being paranoid. She was my wife. We had built a life together, a house in Seattle, a business I worked hard to grow. We were supposed to be a team. But the little things started to stack up. She stopped asking about my day, laughed less at my jokes, and seemed always to have her mind somewhere else. The final straw came at a party we hosted at our home. I had been pouring drinks for some guests when I caught Lauren and her boss, Travis, talking in the corner. It wasn't their conversation that set me off, it was the way they looked at each other, like they shared some unspoken secret. I shook it off and joined some friends in the living room. Later, while grabbing fresh ice from the kitchen, I overheard Travis talking to another guest just around the corner. "She's something else," he said, his voice smug. "The way Lauren and I click, it's only natural. Poor Nathan hasn't got a clue." It hit me like a sucker punch. My hands trembled, but I stayed rooted in place, listening as he continued to brag, his tone dripping with arrogance. That was the moment everything changed for me. I could have stormed out and confronted Lauren right then, but I didn't. I've always been the kind of guy who thinks before he acts, and this time, I wasn't about to make an exception. Anger burned in my chest, but I shoved it down, forcing a smile as I stepped back into the party. Lauren greeted me with a smile of her own, one I now knew was full of lies. That night, as she slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling, thinking about what Travis said. It wasn't just her betrayal that cut deep, it was the sheer audacity. But I wasn't going to yell, scream, or throw accusations. No, I had a better plan. If Lauren wanted to destroy what we had, she wasn't going to walk away unscathed. She didn't know it yet, but her world was about to fall apart. The morning after the party, everything looked the same, yet nothing felt normal to me anymore. Lauren moved around the house with her usual energy, laughing softly as she poured herself coffee and glanced at her phone. To anyone else, she would have seemed completely at ease, but I noticed the tiny pauses, the way she tilted the screen slightly away from me or the forced brightness in her smile. It felt like watching a stranger wearing her face. I kept my demeanor steady, asking her casual questions about her plans for the day while filing every detail away in my mind. I knew I couldn't just lash out or accuse her. That wasn't how I operated. If I was going to confront the reality of what was happening, I needed to approach it carefully, methodically, without letting her know I was onto her. That evening, as she got ready for bed, I watched her from the corner of my eye. She set her laptop on the kitchen counter and disappeared into the bathroom for a shower. My pulse quickened. Lauren was careless with her laptop sometimes, and tonight was no exception. The screen was still on. I hesitated for a moment, my hands hovering over the keyboard. Then I opened her email and calendar. What I saw was enough to make my stomach turn. There were multiple late-night meetings marked off-site that she hadn't mentioned to me. There was also a dinner reservation at a high-end restaurant downtown, one I remembered her brushing off as a last-minute work event. All of these entries were tied to Travis. I scrolled through them with a growing sense of clarity. When Lauren came out of the bathroom, I had already closed the laptop and settled on the couch with a book. She smiled at me before heading upstairs, none the wiser about what I had just discovered. I forced myself to smile back, acting as if nothing had changed. That night, I didn't sleep much. I lay awake next to her, staring at the ceiling, thinking about how long this had been going on and how much of my life had been a lie. Part of me wanted to shake her awake, demand answers, and scream at her until she felt a fraction of the hurt she had caused. But I knew that wouldn't get me what I wanted. Confrontation would only give her the chance to spin the story, to deny or deflect. That wasn't good enough for me. The next day, I hired a private investigator, someone with a reputation for being discreet and thorough. It didn't take long for the confirmation to come back. The investigator handed me a folder filled with photos. Lauren and Travis leaving that same upscale restaurant, laughing, standing too close, with their body language betraying a level of intimacy I couldn't ignore. I stared at those pictures for a long time. They hurt, but they also strengthened my resolve. From that point, I shifted my focus entirely. There was no use wallowing in anger or self-pity. If Lauren and Travis thought they could humiliate me and walk away untouched, they had underestimated me. I started by reinforcing the image of the doting husband. I asked Lauren about her day, offered to help with chores, and even suggested she take time for herself. I played my role perfectly, making sure there was no trace of suspicion in my actions. The guilt in her eyes was subtle but unmistakable, and I let it grow. Meanwhile, I turned my attention to Travis. Using my business contacts, I reached out to one of his strongest competitors, a shrewd and ambitious individual who had been eager to make waves in the industry. I proposed a collaboration that was too good to pass up, one that I knew would overshadow anything Travis was working on. Every detail was planned carefully, ensuring the deal would create ripples that would reach Travis without my involvement being obvious. I didn't stop there. At networking events and casual business gatherings, I planted small, deliberate seeds of doubt about Travis. I never said anything outright, just subtle comments about his decision-making or his ability to manage stress. People listened, because that's what people do when they smell blood in the water. At home, I kept up the facade. I cooked Lauren's favorite meals, left little notes for her, and acted like the husband who had no idea his wife was slipping away. It wasn't easy, but every time I saw her checking her phone with a slight frown or glancing at me with a trace of hesitation, it reminded me that my plan was working. Over the next few weeks, I could see the cracks starting to form. Lauren was growing jumpy, her smiles fading quicker, her phone glued to her hand like a lifeline. She seemed increasingly unsure of herself, as if waiting for something to go wrong. She didn't know it yet, but her life, and Travis's, was already starting to unravel. And I wasn't done yet. The weeks that followed were a strange exercise in patience. I kept my routine steady, ensuring I gave Lauren no reason to suspect that anything was off. If anything, I leaned into being the supportive husband. I encouraged her to take time for herself, subtly nudging her toward decisions that I knew would play into my plan. At the same time, I worked behind the scenes, setting the stage for something far bigger than she or Travis could anticipate. One suggestion I made was for Lauren to reconnect with an old friend of hers, Jenna, whom she had drifted from over the years. I framed it as an innocent idea, saying it might help her decompress from work. Lauren hesitated at first but eventually started meeting Jenna again. What Lauren didn't realize was that Jenna had always been closer to me than to her. It wasn't long before Jenna, true to form, began sharing small pieces of information about their conversations. Nothing major, just hints that Lauren had been venting about feeling misunderstood and overwhelmed. To me, these were coded admissions of guilt. Meanwhile, the partnership I had set up with Travis's rival was gaining traction. The competitor was eager to move forward, and I made sure our plan stayed just visible enough to stir interest. Word began spreading in professional circles, with whispers of a major collaboration that could potentially overshadow Travis's work. I knew it wouldn't be long before this information reached him, and I counted on his ego to magnify the impact. Back at home, Lauren's behavior grew increasingly erratic. She started checking her surroundings more often, especially when her phone buzzed. Sometimes, I would catch her staring at me, as if trying to gauge whether I suspected anything. I never gave her the satisfaction of showing doubt. I remained consistent, playing the role of the thoughtful husband who just wanted her to feel supported. As part of my plan, I began planting subtle rumors in her social circle. They weren't accusations, just carefully worded observations that hinted at her growing distance and secrecy. It didn't take much for these whispers to gain traction. People love a good story, and Lauren's recent behavior provided plenty of fodder. It wasn't long before Lauren began noticing the shift. She mentioned, almost in passing, that certain friends had been acting differently around her. She tried to shrug it off, but I could see the tension in her posture and hear the unease in her voice. I nodded along sympathetically, pretending to share her confusion, while quietly noting that my efforts were starting to take effect. Travis, too, wasn't immune to the fallout. I heard through mutual contacts that he had been more irritable lately, his confidence seemingly shaken. The whispers about his impulsive decisions and questionable priorities had begun to circulate, just as I had intended. I took no pleasure in watching Lauren and Travis grow paranoid. It wasn't about satisfaction. It was about control. They had thought they could betray me without consequences, but they were learning otherwise. By the end of the month, the tension in Lauren's demeanor was unmistakable. She seemed constantly on edge, her usual composure cracking under the pressure of the invisible storm building around her. I could tell she was beginning to feel trapped, though she didn't know yet where the walls were closing in. That was fine. I wasn't in any hurry. The pieces were falling into place, and soon, they would have nowhere to hide. Lauren's unease became more noticeable as the days went on. It was subtle at first, a distracted look when she thought no one was watching or the way she fidgeted during conversations. She seemed restless, like she was constantly bracing for something to happen. I made sure to give her no reason to suspect me. Every morning, I greeted her warmly, asked about her plans, and continued my routine as if nothing had changed. I began to escalate my efforts quietly. With Lauren's paranoia growing, I introduced her to a seemingly harmless idea, confiding in a mutual acquaintance, someone she believed she could trust completely. This person, of course, was someone loyal to me. The suggestion was simple enough. I framed it as a way for her to decompress, subtly steering her into thinking it was her decision. It didn't take long for her to start opening up. The mutual acquaintance would later share snippets of what Lauren revealed, carefully chosen complaints about feeling judged by those around her and vague frustrations about her career. Lauren never mentioned Travis directly, but her discomfort with the increasing rumors in her professional and social circles was evident. Meanwhile, the partnership I had orchestrated with Travis's rival began to ripple further through their shared industry. News of the collaboration started reaching more influential people, and the buzz around it was impossible to ignore. I heard through contacts that Travis had been scrambling to keep his clients calm, insisting that the rumors were overblown. His reputation, so meticulously crafted, was beginning to show cracks. At home, I played my part as the supportive husband to perfection. I started suggesting small weekend getaways, framing them as a way for us to reconnect. Lauren accepted with hesitance, clearly torn between her guilt and her desire to keep up appearances. These trips were less about rebuilding our bond and more about keeping her off balance. The constant mix of affection and normalcy I displayed seemed to heighten her inner conflict. Then came the first major sign that my plan was truly working. One evening, Lauren mentioned that colleagues had been acting distant toward her, their tone carrying an undercurrent of judgment she couldn't quite pinpoint. She described how certain people seemed to avoid her at gatherings, while others offered overly polite smiles that felt insincere. She didn't elaborate much, but the strain was visible on her face. I pretended to be concerned, offering reassuring words without dismissing her feelings. In reality, I was encouraged by the knowledge that the rumors I had planted were beginning to bear fruit. Lauren was now surrounded by whispers she couldn't trace, and I had no intention of stopping them. Travis, too, seemed to be under pressure. A mutual contact mentioned that he had canceled a few high-profile meetings recently, claiming he needed to address internal issues. It was exactly the reaction I had anticipated. The carefully built world he and Lauren had created was starting to shake, and neither of them knew how to stop it. Despite the turmoil swirling around her, Lauren tried to maintain her composure at home. She still made efforts to smile during dinner, asked about my work, and even made small gestures of affection. But her eyes betrayed her. There was a tightness in her expression, a silent plea for reassurance she was too proud to voice. I watched it all quietly, never letting my satisfaction show. The walls were closing in on Lauren and Travis, and they had no idea where the real pressure was coming from. That was the beauty of it. This wasn't about a single confrontation or dramatic moment. It was about dismantling their lives piece by piece, until they had nothing left to hold onto but the consequences of their own actions. Lauren's unraveling became more apparent with each passing week. She tried to keep her composure, but her tension was evident in the smallest details. How she lingered a little too long when checking her phone, or how she avoided eye contact during our conversations. The cracks were widening, and it wasn't just her demeanor. The pressure I had orchestrated was beginning to show in her behavior. At work, her confidence seemed shaken. I overheard her mention a strained relationship with a key client, something she rarely struggled with before. She brushed it off as the client being difficult, but I could tell it was more than that. She was distracted, second-guessing herself in ways I had never seen. Meanwhile, Travis's own troubles were becoming more public. Rumors about his instability and erratic decision-making had started to circulate more openly. These weren't just whispers anymore. They were topics of discussion among those who mattered in his industry. I had carefully ensured that these rumors weren't traced back to me, planting them through people who were only too happy to pass them along as casual observations. At home, I noticed Lauren becoming more cautious around me. She had stopped leaving her laptop or phone unattended and seemed to watch me closely whenever I moved near her things. Her paranoia, however, wasn't strong enough to change her habits completely. Late one evening, while she was occupied upstairs, I found her phone left unlocked on the counter. I didn't need to dig too deeply. Her messages with Travis were sporadic, but what I saw confirmed everything I already knew. Short exchanges about their meetings and vague mentions of their time together painted a clear picture. What stood out most, though, was a message from Travis complaining about the problems at work, blaming outside forces for his recent setbacks. It was satisfying to see my plans having their intended effect, but I reminded myself that this was only the beginning. Lauren, meanwhile, began to retreat from social events. She claimed she was too tired or too busy, but I knew better. She was avoiding people, friends, colleagues, even Jenna. The gossip I had seeded was taking root, and Lauren was finding it harder to face the judgment she thought was coming from every corner. At this point, I started laying the groundwork for my next move. With Travis's big event approaching, a high-profile gathering designed to showcase his success, I knew it would be the perfect stage for their downfall. Quietly, I gathered information about who would be attending. I identified key figures, people who could amplify the whispers I had started and spread them further. Then, I planned a series of anonymous tips to be delivered to select attendees. These tips would suggest that Travis's success wasn't as solid as it seemed, hinting at questionable dealings and personal scandals without outright accusing him. As the event drew closer, Lauren grew more withdrawn. She stayed up later than usual, often staring blankly at her laptop or pacing in the living room. She avoided asking me directly for support, but I could see her struggling to keep the weight of her secrets from crushing her. I offered no confrontation, no accusations. Instead, I continued to be the patient, supportive husband she thought I was. Each kind gesture I made seemed to deepen her guilt, though she never voiced it aloud. The night of Travis's event was fast approaching, and I knew it would be a turning point. By then, the web I had spun would be impossible to escape. Lauren and Travis had underestimated me, and soon, they would pay for it in ways they couldn't begin to imagine. The evening of Travis's grand event arrived, and with it, the perfect storm I had been orchestrating for weeks. I knew this gathering was crucial for him, a chance to solidify his image among the powerful figures in his industry. For Lauren, it was another opportunity to be by his side, playing her part in their shared facade. She spent most of the afternoon preparing, carefully choosing her outfit and double-checking her hair and makeup. I watched her, pretending to be the supportive husband who was content to stay home while she attended alone. She explained her absence with the usual excuse about networking and work commitments. I nodded, wished her well, and even commented on how great she looked. Inside, I was counting down the hours. As soon as Lauren left, I began setting my final plan into motion. Earlier that week, I had prepared a series of anonymous notes, each carefully written to suggest scandal and intrigue. These weren't direct accusations. They were whispers, designed to plant doubt without providing clear answers. The notes hinted at Travis's reckless decision, and suggested ties to personal impropriety that could jeopardize his professional standing. I ensured these notes would reach the right hands during the event. They were discreetly slipped to influential guests, people whose curiosity and influence could carry the message further. The brilliance of it all was that no one could trace the origin of these rumors. They would swirl through the room like smoke, impossible to pin down. Meanwhile, I stayed home, keeping myself busy with small tasks to distract from the weight of the evening. Part of me wondered how Lauren would react when everything started to unravel. Would she try to smooth things over with Travis, or would the pressure finally crack their carefully built illusion? Hours later, as the event was in full swing, I received a text from Jenna. She had attended as a +1 and was more than happy to share updates. The whispers had already started. Guests were huddled in small groups, discussing the notes and speculating about Travis's character and his decisions. Some mentioned his unusual closeness with Lauren, adding an edge of scandal to the conversation. The tension must have been unbearable. By the time Jenna texted again, the mood had shifted from light and celebratory to strained and awkward. She mentioned overhearing a heated conversation between Travis and Lauren, their voices rising above the hum of the crowd before they quickly moved to a private corner. The climax came when a group of guests, emboldened by the rumors, approached Travis directly, demanding answers. From what Jenna described, he fumbled through vague explanations, growing visibly agitated as the confrontation escalated. Lauren tried to intervene, but the damage was done. By the end of the night, Travis's reputation had taken a significant hit, and Lauren's involvement with him was no longer a secret to those in attendance. The whispers had become louder, spreading beyond the event itself. For the first time, they were forced to face the consequences of their actions in a public setting. I sat at home, calm and composed, knowing that the first major domino had fallen. When Lauren returned that night, she barely looked at me. She muttered a brief acknowledgement before heading straight upstairs. I didn't press her for details. She was already unraveling, and I saw no need to accelerate the process. This was only the beginning. Their perfect little world was collapsing, and they had no idea how much further they had to fall. Lauren's silence the morning after the event was deafening. She moved through the house in a daze, avoiding eye contact and barely acknowledging me. The usual forced small talk was gone, replaced by a heavy tension that hung over every interaction. I could tell she was replaying the night in her head, trying to make sense of how everything had spiraled out of control. I didn't ask her what had happened. Instead, I maintained the same calm demeanor I'd been perfecting for weeks. Over breakfast, I casually mentioned plans to spend the day running errands, giving her space to stew in her thoughts. Her only response was a faint nod. As I left, I knew she wouldn't stay home. Lauren never handled stress well. When things became overwhelming, she sought distractions, anything to avoid confronting the mess directly. Sure enough, by the time I returned that afternoon, her car was gone. I didn't need to know where she had gone. The damage had already been done, and I was confident the aftermath of the event was still unfolding. I spent the day preparing for the next stage of my plan, quietly reaching out to a few trusted contacts who had attended the party. Each conversation was casual, but I ensured the right questions were asked. The responses were exactly what I had anticipated. Travis's outburst during the event had left a lasting impression, and the whispers about his relationship with Lauren were spreading rapidly. One contact mentioned that some of Travis's clients were now questioning his judgment, while another hinted at the possibility of a formal complaint being filed against him. Lauren's return later that evening was unremarkable. She slipped back into the house quietly, her face drawn with exhaustion. She muttered something about needing an early night and disappeared upstairs. It was obvious she was unraveling, but I didn't intervene. I wanted her to feel the weight of everything pressing down on her, knowing there was no escape. Over the next few days, the cracks in Lauren and Travis's relationship became impossible to ignore. She grew more withdrawn, spending hours on her phone and pacing around the house. Occasionally, I caught fragments of her muffled phone calls, conversations filled with tension and frustration. It didn't take much to guess who she was speaking to. Meanwhile, I began steering the situation further. I subtly encouraged Lauren to reconnect with certain friends who were known for their bluntness, people who wouldn't hesitate to call her out on her behavior. At the same time, I made sure my own social interactions painted me as the devoted husband trying to support his wife through a challenging time. The effect was almost immediate. Lauren started facing more probing questions from her friends, who had clearly heard the rumors circulating about her and Travis. She tried to laugh them off, but the strain in her voice gave her away. Each conversation chipped away at her defenses, leaving her more exposed and vulnerable. Travis, too, was struggling. News of his unprofessional behavior at the event had reached his superiors, and his position within the company was becoming increasingly unstable. I heard through my network that he had been called into several meetings to address concerns about his conduct. By the end of the week, both Lauren and Travis were fighting battles on multiple fronts. Their once confident facade was gone, replaced by desperation and uncertainty. It was exactly where I wanted them to be, trapped in a web of their own making, with no idea who had spun it. As I watched Lauren retreat further into herself, I felt a grim sense of satisfaction. She had no idea that the calm, supportive husband she still relied on was the same person orchestrating her downfall. And soon, even the illusion of control she clung to would slip through her fingers. By the start of the next week, the cracks in Lauren's world had become fissures. She was still trying to keep up appearances, but the strain was impossible to miss. Her once perfectly composed demeanor was fraying, and I could see the toll it was taking. She was distracted at home, fumbling over simple tasks and forgetting things she would normally remember with ease. More than once, I noticed her checking her phone obsessively, as if waiting for some kind of reassurance that never came. The guilt and paranoia were eating away at her, and I made sure to let it happen without offering her any emotional relief. I stayed consistent, supportive, steady, and patient. She might have interpreted it as kindness, but for me, it was a strategy. Meanwhile, the fallout from Travis's event was becoming more pronounced. Mutual contacts began sharing snippets of gossip about his recent struggles. Some mentioned that clients had started pulling out of contracts, citing concerns about his reliability. Others hinted that internal reviews within his company were targeting him for mismanagement. It was clear that his reputation, once carefully cultivated, was in freefall. At home, I continued playing my part, but I started pushing Lauren subtly toward decisions that would backfire. I suggested she address the rumors directly with her colleagues, knowing it would only fan the flames of suspicion. I encouraged her to lean on certain friends for advice, fully aware that they were the same people spreading whispers behind her back. She took the bait. A few days later, she attempted to explain herself to a colleague over coffee. I didn't need to be there to know how it went. One of my contacts filled me in later. Her efforts to dismiss the rumors only raised more questions, leaving her looking defensive and unconvincing. The colleague apparently shared the details of their conversation with others, amplifying the very gossip Lauren had been trying to suppress. At the same time, I continued planting doubts about Travis. Through anonymous tips and well-placed suggestions, I made sure key figures in his industry started questioning his credibility. I wanted him to feel the same isolation and distrust that Lauren was experiencing. Lauren's behavior at home shifted again. She was quieter, avoiding eye contact and speaking only when necessary. I noticed her growing irritability, snapping at small inconveniences and retreating to the bedroom for long stretches of time. She had stopped asking about my day altogether, too consumed by her own turmoil to feign interest. By now, I was already planning the final stage of my revenge. Both Lauren and Travis were teetering on the edge, and it wouldn't take much to push them over. I wanted their downfall to be complete, but more importantly, I wanted them to realize they had orchestrated it themselves. The date for another key industry event was approaching, one that promised to bring together many of the same influential figures from Travis's earlier debacle. This time, my involvement would be even quieter, but the impact would be devastating. As the pieces of my plan fell into place, I stayed patient, knowing the end was near. Lauren and Travis had no idea what was coming, but I could see it clearly. Their betrayal had set this chain of events in motion, and soon, they would face the consequences of every decision they had made. The days leading up to the next industry event felt like a countdown to the inevitable. By now, Lauren was barely holding herself together. She had grown jumpy and withdrawn, spending most of her evenings alone in the bedroom. Occasionally, I heard her muffled voice through the walls, speaking on the phone in hushed tones. Though she tried to hide it, the weight of the rumors and her crumbling reputation was clearly too much for her to ignore. I kept my interactions with her light and unassuming, continuing to play the part of a husband who was oblivious to her turmoil. Every now and then, I'd casually mention something I'd read or heard about her industry, always steering the conversation toward topics that I knew would unsettle her further. Meanwhile, I was finalizing the details of my plan for the upcoming event. I had carefully crafted another round of anonymous messages, each one targeting specific individuals who would be in attendance. This time, the messages didn't just hint at Travis's professional failings. They pointed directly to the inappropriate nature of his relationship with Lauren. These notes didn't need to be overly explicit. They were crafted to raise questions and sow doubt, ensuring that anyone who received them would draw their own conclusions. The beauty of it was that none of this could be traced back to me. It would all appear as if the truth was simply coming to light on its own. The night of the event arrived, and Lauren was unusually quiet as she prepared to leave. Her movements were deliberate but lacking their usual grace, as though every step required conscious effort. I didn't ask where she was going or when she'd be back. I simply watched her go, knowing she was walking straight into the storm I had created. From the updates I received later that night, it was clear that everything had gone according to plan. The whispers about Lauren and Travis were now impossible to ignore. Several key figures in their circles had received the anonymous messages, and by the time the event was in full swing, the tension in the room was palpable. According to one of my contacts, Lauren and Travis had tried to keep their distance from one another, clearly aware that eyes were on them. But the damage had already been done. Conversations around them were charged with speculation, and their every move was scrutinized. At one point, Travis was pulled aside by a group of senior executives. Though I didn't have the exact details of the conversation, I could imagine the questions he was forced to answer. His confidence, once his greatest asset, had become his downfall. Lauren, meanwhile, looked visibly shaken. My contact described her as pale and tense, avoiding anyone who tried to approach her. She had likely come to the realization that there was no escaping the fallout. When she returned home later that night, it was clear she had reached her breaking point. She didn't speak to me or even glance in my direction as she walked through the door. She went straight to the bedroom, shutting the door behind her without a word. I didn't follow her. There was no need. Everything was unraveling exactly as I had planned. Lauren and Travis had built their relationship on lies and betrayal, and now they were watching it collapse around them. But I wasn't finished yet. The final piece of my plan was still waiting, and it would ensure that the consequences of their actions were felt long after the dust had settled. The days following the event were eerily quiet. Lauren moved through the house like a shadow, barely speaking and avoiding my presence whenever possible. She looked exhausted, her eyes hollow and distant, as if the weight of everything that had happened was pressing down on her with unbearable force. At work, I heard that Travis had become the center of even more scrutiny. The executives who had confronted him at the event were now launching a formal investigation into his conduct. Rumors of impropriety, poor decision-making, and his connection to Lauren were being whispered not just behind closed doors but openly in meetings. His standing in the company was crumbling, and people were already speculating about how long it would be before he was asked to step down. Lauren's social circle, once a carefully curated network of allies and admirers, had also begun to turn on her. Friends who had once eagerly included her in conversations and outings now seemed to keep their distance. Jenna, who had been a steady source of updates for me, mentioned that several mutual friends had questioned Lauren's integrity, their doubts fueled by the rumors I had so carefully planted. It wasn't long before Lauren confronted me, not with accusations, but with desperate attempts to salvage what was left of her life. She made vague comments about feeling overwhelmed, and suggested that we take a break to reevaluate our marriage. Her words lacked conviction, and I could see the fear behind them. She wasn't offering a solution, she was grasping at straws, hoping to regain some control. I agreed without hesitation, keeping my tone measured and calm. I assured her that I wanted what was best for both of us, knowing that my cooperation would only deepen her guilt. While Lauren packed a small bag and left to stay with a friend, I began the final phase of my plan. I had been collecting every piece of evidence, the messages, the photos, the financial records that pointed to her questionable expenses during her time with Travis. It was all neatly compiled, ready to be used when the moment was right. I contacted a lawyer the next morning, filing for divorce and ensuring that the terms were heavily in my favor. With the evidence I had, there would be no room for Lauren to argue or negotiate. She had tied her reputation to Travis, and both of them were now free-falling without a safety net. The fallout was swift. Lauren returned a few days later, expecting to have a conversation about our break. Instead, she was met with the reality of a marriage that was already over. She didn't argue or plead. She simply nodded, as if she had known this moment was coming all along. Travis's career, meanwhile, came to an abrupt end. The investigation within his company revealed enough misconduct to justify his termination. His name became synonymous with scandal, and the professional connections he had spent years building evaporated overnight. For Lauren, the consequences were equally devastating. The friends who once admired her now avoided her, unwilling to be associated with the rumors and gossip that followed her everywhere. Professionally, her reputation had taken a hit she couldn't recover from, and the opportunities she had relied on began to dry up. As for me, I moved forward with my life, free from the lies and betrayal that had defined the last few months of our marriage. I didn't feel triumphant or vindicated. This wasn't about winning, it was about justice, about ensuring that neither Lauren nor Travis would ever forget the consequences of their choices. Their lives, once built on deceit, had crumbled into ruin. And as I stood on the other side of it all, I felt a quiet sense of closure. They had destroyed themselves, piece by piece, with only a little nudge from me.